Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a spoiler-free and also a spoiler review for Side Jobs by Jim Butcher. This is book number 12.5 in the Dresden files, and unfortunately I've misplaced my physical copy. I did listen to this on audiobook, but I have physical copies of all of the others, so I just don't know where it is. So you're just gonna have to make do with an image for this review. But this is a collection of short stories set in the Dresden files universe, and it ranges from before Stormfront to an hour after Changes, which is book 12 in the series. And thankfully this audiobook distinguishes where each short story is set. So it tells you that it's set between Proven Guilty and Deadbeat, for example. And so I'm going to list all of those in the description. The description will be spoiler free. So if you want to jump in and out of reading the short stories in between reading the actual books, then you can do that with this video description, because I saved them all and read them all at once. But I think if I read them in tandem when I was reading the series, I would have loved that experience as well. So now you can do that if you want to. So there are 11 short stories in here in total. All of them, like I said, take place throughout the series, which I really appreciated because I saw different characters and I knew where they were because I'd read Changes. So I knew where their character growth had ended up, but it was cool to actually revert back and see what they used to be like in a different context, which was pretty cool. And we also got to see from different perspectives in the series, not just Dresden, which I found really interesting. And I was a bit apprehensive going into them for that reason, because I'm so tied to Dresden's perspective. I'm so used to him and the way he describes things and experiences things. I'm used to his skill set and his environment and his just general personality. And so when I was like, oh, this is not Dresden's perspective, it was actually very unique, and I think Jim Butcher really captured the different voices that he talked from. I would say who they are, but I might just leave that for the spoiler section, just in case you're starting the series fresh, because if I say their names, you're going to know that they're going to get developed later, and that might take some tension away from the beginning of the series, and I don't want to do that because we love surprises. So I'm going to keep this part spoiler free, and when I switch to spoilers, I'll change the outline of the video to red, so that way you know when to pause this video and say goodbye in the comments. So all in all, I found this was paced quite well, even though they were all short stories. Although personally, I don't really like short stories that much, short story collections I mean, because it feels like I'm just getting into something and then the story ends. So I really only gave this entire collection a 4 stars out of 5, based on my own kind of experiences and preferences rather than how the actual stories were. So I appreciated how they were paced. I liked how they were interspersed with action and characterization and world building that we'd already partly experienced. But if you're picking the Dresden files up for the first time and you start with this book, I don't know why you would, considering it's 12.5 in a series, but if you do start here, I think there is great foundations here as well. And like I said, one of the stories starts before the first book in the series, Stormfront, so you could conceivably start with this one and then go into the first book. So from that angle, I think Jim Butcher set things up really well, and everything I understood, and I really appreciated the new little insights and details we got to support further context in the main series, which I feel is what a short story collection should do. It should add to the meaning that's already created, and that's definitely what this did. Jim Butcher really nailed it with this short story collection. I just personally don't love short story collections because I feel like the tension can come and go because there's such a short amount of time to build certain things up. So like I said earlier, I'm just getting into it and then it finishes. So I prefer a more long form story, and obviously because I'm a fantasy reader, I read massive fantasy series, so I'm used to a long time of something building up. But if you're somebody who prefers something short and snappy, and a lot of these urban fantasy books by Jim Butcher are pretty snappy and pretty fast paced, I think you'll quite enjoy this short story collection, and it's a 4 out of 5 stars. It's not like a bad book for me. I really quite enjoyed it actually. But now I want to talk about spoilers, so if you haven't read the books, I would recommend you pause the video here and come back later. So we're jumping into the spoiler section now, and I'm going to spoil everything, the ending, everything. So if you haven't read Changes or up to Changes in the series, probably don't watch this either, because there's going to be spoilers up to that point in the series as well. That is your warning. Let's get into my thoughts. So the side characters that I mentioned before, we got to see Murphy, Thomas, Billy, and the werewolves. And I love how we got to see Molly in a flashback, or not really in a flashback, but in one of the short stories when she was still just Dresden's apprentice. And she had all of that drive, the get up and go, the bubbliness, and that innocence with her. Now that I read Changes and Ghost Story and I know what happens, it kind of breaks my heart to go back and reread things about Molly, because you can see how far she's come now and how dark and somber her character has become compared to what she used to be before, which was quite optimistic. So she's just had so much change happen to her, and I really loved going back and seeing her in a more optimistic role. I liked that. And I also enjoyed seeing from Thomas's perspective as well, which I'll get into a little bit later, as well as Murphy's perspective. I also really like what I said before about context for the main series coming together in these short stories. So Marcone, Guard, and Murphy, for example, obviously in Ghost Story they are working together, but you don't really know how that came about. And I like how this story in Side Jobs really told you and showed the beginnings of their formation of their relationship and the kind of business side nature attached to it as well. I really, really loved Aftermath, but I'll get into that shortly. And it was also quite nice to see Michael and the Carpenters, however fleeting, in this short story collection as well, because I've missed seeing Michael. I know he's technically retired, but I liked revisiting him here as well, and he had such a fire to him still, and I didn't see a lot of that in the previous books, so it was nice to again explore a new angle of him that we hadn't really seen before, because usually he's cool, calm and collected, but when his daughter gets kidnapped, all bets are off. And I liked seeing that more fiery, hard side of him compared to obviously a determined side to him that we get to experience in the story, but he's always very level-headed, and I liked that Dresden got to work with him when he was a little bit more invested in what was going on. Not that he wasn't invested before, but again, I like just how fiery he was and how determined he was in this particular collection. So I've made some notes about the different stories that I liked that had standout things that I reacted to. So I'm going to say the title and then the things that I really liked about them, but that doesn't mean that I didn't like the stories that I don't mention, if that makes sense. It's just these stood out to me more on memory, so that's what I wanted to talk about. In Something Borrowed, we saw Georgia and Billy and their wedding, and I like that we got more context about the werewolves, because Murphy is working with them in Ghost Story, but we haven't seen a lot of them. They have been tangential and side characters, but we got a lot of short stories about them, which was pretty cool. So we got to see their characters, we got to see people around them develop too, and we got to see Murphy's and Billy's mainly connection in Aftermath, which I loved so much. And something that I also really enjoyed in Something Borrowed was the fact that Murphy met Bob the Skull for the first time, and I feel like that should have been in the main series. That seems to be quite a significant moment, because Dresden doesn't really tell many people that Bob is a thing, that Bob exists. Only Thomas really knows, and because he's related to Dresden, that makes sense, but I like that Murphy now knows about him too. Obviously in the main series more people know about Bob now, but it's cool that Murphy has actually now met him, and I found that quite funny. In the short story It's My Birthday Too, we got to see Harry and Thomas's interaction, and I just loved that Harry bought Thomas a birthday present. I found that very wholesome, and it just showed that undercurrent of brotherly emotion that we don't get a lot of, because it was like a quiet scene with Thomas and Dresden, and I really enjoyed that quiet character building, because often when Thomas is part of a story we get to see a lot of hardcore action and a lot of high stakes, but I liked this more quieter moment between their characters as well. I think it balanced out what is going on in the main series, it balanced that out quite well. Also in the shopping mall in this story, I loved how cataclysmic the gravity magic was. It was so cool, it was cinematic, I could imagine everything in my head, which is no surprise to me reading a Dresden book, but it was just still really cool to read, because I didn't expect such big moments in a short story collection, but when it happened it was so cool. And there was also a moment in here that was a little bit smaller, but it still made me laugh, and that was when Dresden was threatening the little fairy folk with destroying the shoes by holding them over the trash can like they were on ransom or something. I found that very funny. I had to pause the audiobook actually because I was laughing so much. And then in Day Off, when Dresden was playing D&D, and it opens up with a battle kind of scenario and you don't really know what's going on, but it turns out that Dresden is just playing Dungeons and Dragons with a bunch of friends, and he keeps nitpicking their imaginary magic use, which I found really great and hilarious, because obviously he would do that. And then later, I laughed a lot in this particular story, and then later when the werewolves, they had like fleas according to the site, and then they kind of went nutso and chased Mouse around, who was in turn chasing Mister, and it just turned into all of these animals in Dresden's apartment chasing each other, and it was just utter chaos. I laughed a lot reading that as well. I didn't like that Anastasia Lucio was still in a relationship with Dresden at that point, because that wasn't my favourite part of the Dresden Files series, but I like that hilarious moment that was supposed to be Dresden's day off, but it turned out to have explosions and random animals and problems with the site just happening in Dresden's world, when he should just be able to relax. The guy just needs a break, honestly. And then really quickly in The Warrior, when Dresden tries to bill Uriel for his time. Of course Dresden would do that though, of course he would. Backup was awesome, because that was from Thomas's perspective. And I don't know how Jim Butcher managed to do that, but the tone is varied so much if you are reading from Dresden's perspective compared to if you are reading from Thomas's. It was so somber and so dark, and while reading the main series, I was like, why can't Thomas just tell Harry what he wants and what he thinks and how he feels and all the tension behind his character? Why does he have to be this kind of brooding guy who's really keeping Harry at arm's length? But now that I've read from his perspective, I really understand him, and I think that Harry actually wouldn't understand. And so I found that an interesting gear shift when reading this short story, because now I actually agree with Thomas rather than Harry. And I liked seeing into Thomas's perspective because he told us about a 5,000-year-long war that has been going on with the vampire White Court and the demons who are like the old gods. And if too many people remember them, it gives them power, which is why a lot of people don't know about them. Not even Harry. Bob the Skull does, because Thomas confided in him to help save Harry's life. But the fact that Harry Dresden doesn't even know that there's a war going on, even though he's got all of this other intense stuff going on his plate, something in the future surely has to cross over, because that can't be kept secret forever, I imagine. Something's got to go down. But that was really interesting, and I loved having that gear shift again with Thomas, because it gave a lot more flavour and understanding to his character that I really hadn't experienced before. And you can only really do that from being in his head, because he talks about his demon for the vampire part of him, and you don't really understand that part of him unless you are seeing from his eyes, which I found awesome as well, because you got to see his skill set compared to Dresden, because he would often have a mental comparison. Probably Jim Butcher did that so the reader could compare as well, but I really liked that because it showed how different his approach was compared to Harry, which was cool to see. And then in Love Hurts, I imagine this is a story that a lot of people liked, but I just found this kind of middle of the road. So this is when Dresden and Murphy go on a date to a fair, and they're effectively undercover to find out who the Fae creature is who is putting everybody under these love spells that don't want to be put under them, and then they end up killing each other. They're trying to replicate love, basically, so they can fight against the White Court, because the White Court vampires are burned by true love. And while Dresden and Murphy are investigating this, they naturally fall into the love spell, and they're aware of doing it, and they spend some time together, and there is a kiss. But when I read that kiss, I was like, I know it's not canon, like it's not canonically in the main story, and so it feels like Jim Butcher threw us a bone in terms of forming a chemistry with these characters. But because it's not mainstream, it didn't really convince me. So I didn't dislike it. It's just not my favourite story in the collection. But given how much I've been banging on about how much I love Dresden and Murphy together, I feel like I had to mention it, because if I didn't, someone would be like, what's going on? This story happened and you didn't say anything. And that's mostly because I just didn't love it, but I liked it for what it was. I think it could have been better, I guess, but I don't know. It just didn't sit with me in a way that I loved it, because I knew that it wouldn't be endgame, because it was a short story in a short story collection, if that makes sense. Like, I knew it would be short-lived rather than something that would cement itself in the main series. And then, holy crap, I got to Aftermath, and that's set an hour after Changes ends, and it's from Murphy's perspective. So you get to see Murphy's perspective on Dresden's disappearance/death. And that was intense and so emotional to me. She said Harry and I were supposed to get a few drinks and then see what happened. Instead, I found nothing but his blood. And when I was listening to that, I was like, my poor heart. Ow, 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 ow. It was so heartbreaking, but Murphy was so determined. And I loved how she got together with the werewolves and they solved this mystery. And she basically went to a warehouse full of demon kind of goons and took them on by herself. She's so badass. And the action in that scene, it felt like I was watching an action movie in my head. She is so incredible. And I love how she's taken all of the knowledge of the magic that Dresden has used in the past, and she has applied that to things that happened to her in Aftermath. It shows that she's really grown and learned. Despite just being human, she can hold her own against some real nasty creatures, which is pretty damn cool, because not a lot of people can do that. And there was a moment too where Murphy was facing off with Marcone, not in a gunfight kind of way, just in a political conversation kind of way. And Billy the werewolf was stabbed and there was blood all over a knife. And before Murphy handed the knife back, she wiped all the blood off. In her internal dialogue, she was like, I know that Dresden doesn't like giving blood over to enemies because it can be used in a lot of nasty spells. So based on that knowledge, acknowledge she's basically saved Billy's life. And Gard looked at her approvingly. And that is where the relationship between Murphy, Gard and Marcone, I feel like, started, which is what we see the aftermath of, in Ghost Story. We see all of them working together, somewhat haphazardly, but Murphy is very cutthroat, and I think that's where it started. And that's what I really liked about this short story collection overall, because we got to see a lot of foundations after Dresden's death in Changes. We got to see a lot of the foundations built up in this short story collection to underscore what has gone on in Ghost Story in the time that Dresden has been gone. And I like that we've got some understanding of how the characters developed after that point, and we get to see outside of Dresden's perspective as well. I basically just really liked this short story collection, and I'm not someone who usually likes short story collections, but I think Jim Butcher really pulled it off in terms of nailing his character voices and the tone and just the way that the action was fast paced and the tension was built. Normally I don't like a short story, but I think I would read more of his short stories. So that's really a good summation of how I was impressed by his work as a short story when I'm used to reading it obviously as a longer book. So you've probably guessed my favourite short story. It was definitely Aftermath. I have given this collection overall a 4 stars like I said before, and I really enjoyed it, but I can't wait to get back into the main series now. I'm happy that I read this, don't get me wrong, and I was going to skip over this actually, but I'm really glad that I was convinced not to, because I think that my understanding going forward of the series is really multifaceted now that I've read this, because I've got a lot more context. So thank you so much for telling me to read this. Thank you so much for watching this video. Come and chat with me down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.